What I wanted to do was kind of update the talk I gave to this group 10 years ago. And now, since none of you were here 10 years ago, I can say anything I want because you have no idea what I said the last time by way of update. But the last opportunity I had was really to share my journey in terms of prostate cancer. I had like many of you, let's get a couple of data points here. How many of you watch hockey? Thanks to the fact that you live in Calgary, are you aware that there's playoffs? Okay, I'm a part owner of the Nashville Predators. Last year we did well. This year it sucks. So it's just the way life goes. What I meant to ask is how many of you have had prostate cancer or are dealing with it now? I know it's a, holy shit. All right, well, me too. It's a great cancer to catch early. It's a terrible cancer to catch late. And as a result, one of the reasons I come to stage regularly is to talk about the cause, the challenges, and quite frankly, raise awareness, because when we don't talk about it, we don't have a hope. As most of you would acknowledge, 20 years ago, most diseases for men that were below the belt, you would just scratch until it went away. Because you weren't going to talk about it. You didn't want to tell your spouse or your partner. It was just something. I had someone come up to me even 4 or 5 years ago and say, "You had cancer of the dick, didn't you?" Well, not exactly. I mean, they're all, it's kind of, you can Google it. And then how many people still call it the prostate? I mean, a little wrong, but at least you're in the right idea. 20 years ago, it was a disease you didn't want to talk about because it was a shame. You know, when I let my dad know that I had been diagnosed with prostate cancer, it was an, oh, Jesus. You, Uncle Ben, me. I'm going, Uncle Ben had it? He said, oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. It was still a shameful moment. Uncle Ben had prostate cancer and nobody in the family knew. Because it probably involved the rectum and the penis and some things that you don't talk about and you certainly don't look at. And that's why there's this stigma that used to hang over the challenge of prostate cancer. But fortunately, through work like Prostate's doing, like conversations like we're having tonight, like every single one of you who've announced to your own family and friends, I would hope that you are facing and dealing with prostate cancer, those of you who are, we lift the stigma and we lift the veil. Early detection is the key to prostate cancer treatment. The earlier you catch it, you know, the more options you have. Now, I'm going to talk at times like I'm a doctor. I'm not. I'm just a highly frustrated individual. When I found out I had prostate cancer, it was quite by accident. I had no symptoms. At least I had no symptoms I was willing to talk about. That line, no matter how much you wiggle and dance, the last few drops go in your pants. You know, like who do you tell? I mean, so what? A little bit of dribbling's no big deal. You just wear a dark suit and you manage, right? Older men know that. I happened to go to a medical clinic with a couple of friends. 4 or 5 of us treated it as an adventure. And I remember doing the blood work associated with just a regular checkup and then having the dreaded digital exam. And I think the guy was there for about 15 minutes by my, warped recollection. And I remember asking, is there anything unusual going on here? And he said, no, I was just feeling. Well, it turns out that was on a Friday. On the Monday morning, I got my PSA back, and it had gone 3 years earlier from 0.2 to 7.5. And that caused him some concern because of my age. I was 43 years old. He encouraged me to go and get a biopsy right away. And there was a journey in terms of getting the biopsy. It took a little longer than I thought normal, or what normal's not even the right word, longer than it should have been. And then it was a couple of weeks. And then it took longer than it should have to get the results. And there was some human confusion in the middle. So that was frustrating. And then I remember getting a call from the doctor saying, I wish I had more time to deal with you, but I got to go to the airport. I'm late for something. I just want to let you know you have cancer. Bedside manner, thank you. And I've booked you for surgery in mid-August, so a couple of months out. Interestingly, when I got the call from the doctor saying that you have cancer, just 5 minutes earlier, I had gotten a joyous call from my divorce lawyer saying, she signed it. We're done. So, and frankly, my divorce was 98% amicable and 2% memorable. And we dealt with the last little bit of what we call memorable. And I had said to my assistant at the time, you can close the divorce file. And as the call came in from the doctor to say that you now have cancer, I just looked at her and said, I guess the results are in, we can open a cancer file. She cried, I cried. It was just one of those very emotional moments that a number of you faced when the C word comes into your life. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear, a lot of concern. What the hell? Now, as it turned out, I wanted to explore options. I wasn't convinced that surgery was necessarily the right option for me. And as we started going down the path of understanding my Gleason score, which was high, my PSA, which had actually jumped to 11 by the time summer was over, as we looked at the gradation and we looked at the Parton score, the odds of me having cancer outside the gland were high. And so I was less interested in surgery. For me, again, be really careful in comparing yourself to other people who've had prostate cancer, because the facts are all different. The disease appears to be the same, but the facts are all different. So in my case, it looked like I had cancer outside the gland, 85% probability. So when I stumbled across what was then an experimental surgery, an experimental program called brachytherapy, seeds, radiation, I went with that. The engineer in me said, I still remember the doctor suggesting to me that if he saw, when he was removing the prostate, if he saw any cancer, he'd just scrape it away. Fuck, that's not good enough. If you see it, you'll scrape it away. And again, I don't know if cancer shows up as little black dots or little candy cane circles. I don't know what's going on, but I wasn't convinced that that was the right solution. So I chose radiation. I also chose radiation at a clinic down in the States. Obviously, there was a cost. I was in a position to afford that. But it was also early days in terms of that radiation treatment. So I was successful. PSA got hammered down. I did the radiation. And in fact, it turns out I did the the surgery, the week of 9/11. I flew home and went back down a couple days right after 9/11. And strangely, the airlines were empty. It was pretty easy to get around. And I had to go, so I wasn't afraid of flying. I just had to get on a plane. So that was 2001, and that was round one. My own personal life was a shambles. I had just completed my divorce, as I mentioned. I didn't have a relationship with my children that I was proud of. In fact, I didn't even have one that I could talk about. Because I'd been working 24/7, failed marriage made it easier to work. The more I worked, probably the harder it was on my marriage. But there was a gap in my life, and when cancer came into it and I was facing my own mortality, I was scared. You don't know what you don't have until it's gone. And in my case, I didn't know what I had relative to a relationship with my family, and all of a sudden it looked like I might be gone. I still remember driving out to my cabin, and I had a friend of mine with his kids, and we were all driving out to Windermere together. And I was sitting quietly. It was the July long weekend, and I still hadn't disclosed to anybody other than a couple of key staff and my doctor that I had prostate cancer. And I was writing out my funeral plans. I had a will, that was all sorted out, but I was writing my funeral plans. I thought that would be a cathartic, worthwhile process to get out of the way, because I had some thoughts on, I listed who my pallbearers would be. I listed who would speak, who would MC, who would sing, who would do whatever. Wrote all that stuff out. I remember being a little emotional, kind of choking up a little bit, and kind of crying into my glasses, my sunglasses, and my son tapped me on the shoulder, and I was like, oh, I'm going to have to talk about all this now. He saw me crying. And he said, Dad, yeah? He says, I have to pee. Well, that was the end of my pity party. We stopped, we peed, and got on with life. But I had written out. And it actually was a cathartic process. I make fun of it a little bit, but it was a cathartic process because I could park and say, all right, that's done. I've dealt with the dying side of looking at cancer. Now I'm going to get on with the living side. And as it turns out, I had a fax machine out at the cabin, and it was July 1st, and I was faxing my results to US clinics because on July 1st, they're all open. July 4th is their day off. So I spent the morning of my birthday, which happens to be July 1st, faxing my results to 3 or 4 clinics saying, what are my options? And again, at that time, I was looking to explore the non-surgical options. The robotic arm didn't exist. Certainly didn't exist in Alberta, certainly didn't exist in Canada. And brachytherapy was this kind of out there. There was a few other things, cryotherapy, but I was, as an engineer, I was skeptical on the science of freezing it. I would rather fry it than freeze. So I was a little bit uncertain there. I decided to go down to Florida for my treatments. But before I went, I thought about the tools that I was going to have with me relative to being down there for 6 weeks, relatively alone, long way from home. And I decided to hire a sports psychologist to work with me on mental toughness, a belief that there might be some linkage between your emotional state, your mental state, if you will, and your ability to deal with disease. Why not? What's the downside? I reached out to 4 friends, Ken King, Jim Poplinski, a buddy of mine who's best friends with some of the top golfers in the world, a guy named Mike Smith, and I reached out to a university professor friend of mine. Strangely, I reached out and every email at that time said, a buddy of mine's been diagnosed with cancer and is looking for someone. Every one of these people came back within probably 15 minutes, and every one of them speculated that that buddy was me. So I didn't do a very good job of hiding that first data point. And all of them suggested several of the well-known sports psychologists in Calgary. The overlap between several of them was a guy named David Pankovic. And I ended up going up to the university, sitting down with this university professor, a specialist in sports psychology. And we're chatting a bit about my life experience and where I was at and what I was doing. And he said, Brett, I'm not sure I get this. You have a great attitude. I said, that's the problem. He looked, I said, I need an incredible attitude because this is about my life. I don't intend to lose this game, if you want to call it the game of life. I don't intend to come second. He said, okay, game on. First things first, you are a workaholic. You've got a bit of a problem there. I need you to slow down a bit. I need you to read this book called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. Or Stole His Ferrari? Some of you must know the book. It's out there. The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. Well, when I went back to see him 3 days later, I had read it, but actually, one of my staff read it and did a book report for me because I was a little tight for time, and so I just got the summary of each chapter. But that allowed me to have an intelligent conversation about the essence of what this book was about. So we took care of that. What was interesting, though, is he then took me down a path of understanding in the world of sports psychology what a psychologist does relative to a coach. And the differentiation was fascinating. And where we spent time was understanding the importance and relevance of mental toughness. The relevance, for example, of visualization. I had used visualization in swimming after being coached by a couple of people I was on a swim team with. And I was by far the amateur in this team that was competing actually we were at the World Championships for Masters Swimming, and I was the lightweight. And one of them sat down and said, I want you to visualize every stroke. There's 12 strokes down, 12, you know exactly what you're doing. I want you to visualize every one of them and pull harder than you've ever pulled. It was an interesting exercise, and I did swim one of my best swims of my life with less training than I'd ever had. So I knew that visualization had relevance for me, but I'd never thought of it in the context of prostate cancer. And so I developed my own mantra when I was in the radiation equipment, which was fry, cry, and die. Just those 3 words were part of my thinking. Did it help? I don't know, I'm still here. But it felt right, it felt good at the time. Besides visualization, he also encouraged me to spend some time in the genres of humor and inspiration, books and movies. Well, I ended up taking 2 movies with me, and I'm a pretty simplistic guy. Civil engineer by training, you just repeat what you're doing. The road, every step of the way, repeats. So I watched the same humor movie every second night and the same inspirational movie on the alternate nights. The inspirational movie, still my favorite movie. I still cry in the same parts. I still get emotional when I even talk about the movie. But it was Rudy. Rudy Rutabaga. The guy who, against all odds, ended up playing for the Fighting Irish. Fight, fight, fight. And if you've ever seen the movie, you'll know how good that feels when you're watching this guy against all odds, against family, against the people, his teachers, his coaches. Nobody believed in this guy except him. A very, very empowering movie. I still use it in all genres when I'm looking or chatting with people who are having a tough day. Rudy. On the humor side, imagine this room stoned, running around naked. That's pretty much the show called Saving Grace. Saving Grace is a British comedy. The Brits, as you know, are completely irreverent about almost anything. In this case, it was a woman whose husband, philandering husband, who had pissed away the entire estate, left her with a mansion, but all the debts associated when he died suddenly. I think he was shagging his girlfriend, and there's some story. Anyway, it was British humor at its finest. Anyway, she discovers that with her green thumb and a neighbor boy that she can actually grow marijuana. And so the whole show is about one day the greenhouse goes up. There's smoke everywhere. There happens to be an elderly folks' tea going on, and the smoke is wafting through the yard. Then the old folks are getting stoned, and now you get to where I suggest there may be a bunch of relatively gray-haired nakeds running around. And I found that funny. I'm just saying, to me, that was kind of humorous. But those two shows, movies, were on repeat for me. So that was about dealing with the mental side of the whole exercise. Now, the other element of the first round of cancer that I went through was what the doctors at that time, in a somewhat derogatory fashion, referred to as the herbs and spices, supplements, non-traditional medical treatments. And I, for one, was open-minded, because I, for one, don't believe that everyone knows everything. Some call me a climate change denier because I'm an engineer and I question the science of many of the things I hear. But in this case, I questioned the science of just simply taking on the Western way. We'll surgically remove it or we'll fry it with radiation. I really genuinely believed that I could do more with my body. Interestingly, 10, 12 years later, my clinic, the one I used in Florida, has a 12-page document on how to bring supplements into your life as you are and after you've been treated. So they've gone from, don't touch it while we're treating you, the herbs and spices are interesting, but that's not our gig, to understanding that there's an awful lot of different things out there that can be relevant and can be helpful. And then, of course, there's the world of healing, the meditation. I can't tell you how open I am to absolutely all of it. So I had round one 15 years ago. I developed and coined the phrase that I am a cancer graduate a long time ago. For me, a cancer survivor implies that you barely made it. And I take no exception with someone calling themselves a cancer survivor. I don't mean to degrade that at all. But I like the thought that I got my master's about a year ago. I got my bachelor's 15 years ago. And if I need to, I'll go get my PhD. Maybe another master's, who knows? But I'll do what it takes. And for me, it's a more empowering, again, in the idea of mental toughness and attitude, it's a more empowering approach. 5 years after my first round of treatment, I started to bleed. Turns out one of the seeds was coming through the wall of the urethra. About that time, we went in with a camera and they discovered that I had a terrible case of what's called radiation cystitis, the side effects of radiation that hadn't been properly protected. I'd had some bleeding from both the colon and the bladder at the time, not unexpected. Cleans up, heals up, takes care of itself over time. The 4 or 5 months I spent dealing with radiation cystitis was some of the most emotionally draining time of my life. Discovered a program and a protocol called hyperbaric oxygen, HBOT, actively used in recovery from burn victims. There's some cynicism in the medical community as to how well it works, because you go into a high pressure chamber, the same one that's used for depressuring a diver, and breathe enriched oxygen. The goal is to get oxygen inside your body so that your body can heal. and it's used for neurological disorders, it's used for a variety of things. Unfortunately, there isn't enough science to prove it in every application. But in this case, my doctors genuinely believed that I would be best served by taking on HBOT. The Alberta medical system allowed me 12 treatments. At 12, I was already down and I was meeting with some of the top specialists in the world of radiation cystitis in the University of California, San Francisco, Dr. Shinohara. And he asked me, "Are you on HBOT yet?" It was just a routine question. I said, "Yes." "How many treatments?" 12. And he had a camera inside me at the time. And by the way, I've had more cameras in my urethra than Donald Trump has had on his face. It's just something you get used to. I mean, lay down and put your hands back. Yeah, okay, fine. I know the drill. Anyway, he was taking a look and he didn't like what he saw. And he looked at me and said, "You're going to need 50 treatments." That was his estimate in terms of what he saw. And of course, Alberta allowed 12. So then we go into the battle over how do I get more treatments? The equipment's there, it's sitting empty. I'll pay for it. My alternate, which the Alberta health system offered up, was to fly to Vancouver and do it every day there, where I could pay for it the same way that we couldn't do it here. I get a little frustrated by the medical system here and some of its inward thinking, but we're not going to dwell on that or pipelines tonight. Just deal with my pipeline right now. Anyway, so it was a pretty challenging time on a catheter for more than 4 months. Bleeding was intense, clotting was intense. I was admitted by emergency to the Rocky View on 8 separate occasions. On the 8th occasion, actually, I wasn't admitted. I went straight to the urology ward and completely pissed off the whole process because they have a process. But any of you who've been through retention, you know what discomfort that involves. And I wasn't prepared to wait any longer, sitting in the emergency room, squirming with pain that I'd never imagined, taking the stolen pills of whatever the painkillers were they weren't fentanyl, there wasn't anything like that, but it was tough stuff. It was the only way I could survive. And I was driving myself because I was alone at times, stoned on these stupid drugs, trying to get into the hospital. Anyway, on the last occasion, I went straight to the urology ward. And I leaned on the counter as the doctor who was there for the weekend asked me what I was doing at the counter. And I said, "Well, I'm kind of checking myself in." He blew a gasket. "Don't come directly here. You've got to go downstairs." He was pissed. I didn't really care, as you might imagine. And then I went into a bladder spasm. And if any of you have had to suffer bladder spasms, that's yet another level of pain. You combine retention with a spasm where your body is just shaking. And I hit the floor. The doctor came around the corner and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm having a spasm so I can leave and go down and get checked into your hospital." Anyway, he helped me up, got me into a bed, got a catheter in, we got things solved, and I spent 2 days dealing with the bleeding that he was trying to cycle through my body. Dr. Baverstock was the doctor in question, and we are actually very close friends now. We've come a long way from our first meeting at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. His response was reasonable. I had taken no issue with that whatsoever. I'd bypassed, but I also knew I had to get straight to that ward in order to be helped. Anyway, we continued, and it was 4.5 months before I was able to remove a catheter and properly urinate without bleeding. And I'm pretty candid about this because it's part of my journey. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just what happened. Lots of roller coasters in terms of my own life. But my PSA had been holding at 0.8 for about 10 years. There was one cycle where it popped to 2 for 3 months, and next treatment, next pop, it was down, and so we thought that was kind of a false start. But about 3 years ago, it went slowly over the course of a year from 1 to 2. At that point in my mind, I knew something was wrong. But there was no simple diagnostic test to say, here it is, here's what's happened, here's where it is. And so we monitored. I spent quite a bit of time with Pure North, Al Markin's clinic, a gift to community, a gift to Alberta. I can't say enough good things about Al Markin. But frankly, Al was the first person I reached out to, and I said, "I think my cancer's back. But I also know that there's no tools for finding it. So we don't really know where it is, so I'd like to do what we can." And we started on all sorts of protocols there in terms of looking at what we could do, short of surgically defining it or medically defining where the cancer was and dealing with it. It continued to climb 2, 2.25, 2.5. It was climbing slowly, but the PSA told me things were back, that I knew that my cancer was back. So by July of a year and a half, 2.5 years ago now, sat with my doctor and said, all right, what are we going to do here? And it became apparent that I was going to have to get down to one of the US clinics because the tools didn't exist here to look at doing a PET scan on recurrent prostate cancer. Now, before going down there, I went and had a CT scan done at a local pay-to-go clinic and said, please look closely at my lymph nodes. Doesn't look good, in my opinion. That's where cancer logically goes first, as some of you would know, in terms of recurrent, and then from there it may migrate to the bones. But I wanted him to just look in the lymph nodes because that's symptomatically where I thought things were. And the report that came back that afternoon, test in the morning, afternoon, was, in the words of the medical community, nothing remarkable. So nothing that they saw that would cause them any concern, and that was knowing where to look. 3 days later, I was in a clinic at the University of Kansas Kansas University Medical Center, and we did a PET scan, it's called, with a C18 or C11, one of those two isotope. And quite frankly, I didn't need the radiologist to point out where my cancer was, because as we scrolled through the body, there was 4 tumors on fire. One was just getting started and another was waking up. There was 6 tumors, and it was crystal clear where the cancer was. The next day I popped over to Scottsdale, Arizona, met with a specialist there, and 3 weeks later I started a program of what's called tomography, dealing with radiation. The results at the end, and I was doing a lot of different things, working with my naturopathic doctor, and the details don't matter because I don't want to confuse those of you who are going through treatment with the things I was doing between low-dose naltrexone and DCA and a ketogenic diet. And there's a whole bunch of things I did, and I blame all of them for my success. In other words, I give all of them some credit. But I don't want anybody hanging their hat on any one of them because it's all a very individual story. What was interesting for me in round 2 of cancer was my mental attitude. Round 1, I was terrified. Round 1, I was scared, and I looked back and I realized it was because I didn't have a relationship with some of the most important people in my life. My children, my marriage was failing. Even my dad, I was too busy to return all his calls. I'd chat with him every couple of weeks. He'd call every second night to the house, so I knew he was updated on everything the kids were doing and what I was doing. But it wasn't direct. And there was no animosity, I just didn't take the time. This time, when cancer struck, it was an incredibly peaceful thought when I looked at it and said, you know, if I die now, what a run. The gap between round 1 and round 2 has been nothing short of astonishing in terms of my personal journey. The money, the profile, none of that counts. The relationship I enjoyed with all 3 of my kids and others who were important to me. Gap, just a complete gap in terms of those 2 experiences, round 1, round 2. The results, when I got them from the doctor, he'd said, let's wait at least 2 months from the end of your radiation to when you do a PSA. Because of course I'm itching. Let's see, where are the results? Let's go, come on, how have we done? I want to know. And he just was, let's 2 to 3 months, let's wait. So 2 months and a day, I got the work done. And his point was, look, Brett, if the PSA's up, I'm not worried because things are on fire in your body. It might just be fighting you and we'll get it down with time. And if it's down, it might be artificially down because it might still not be properly reflecting. So that's why he said, let's wait a couple of months. And so I did. And fortunately, the results were, in the words of the nurse who called me back and then the doctor who called me an hour later, somewhere between superb and outstanding. So I was pretty happy. And again, go back to crying. That was the only time in round 2 where I cried, and that was tears of joy. That was a feel-good moment when you've beaten it for the second time. Is there a chance it'll be back? Is there a chance it actually recurred? Was it a fresh start? I can challenge doctors, and they don't have a real good answer on that. In other words, the recurrence rate for most people, they're looking at the 5-year and the 10-year rates. I was at 13 or 14 years before it came back. Or did it come back? Did it start fresh? What's to say it can't start all over again? I don't know. Doesn't matter, but I will say, watch what you're doing. That's probably the most important message in all of this. Never, never, never let your guard down. I take exception with where the Canadian Cancer Society was 15 years ago. Because their rule of thumb was, unless there's 2 data points, in other words, your father and a brother, or a father and an uncle, you don't need to get tested until you're 50. Well, to start with, I didn't know about my uncle because it was a secret. So we only had 1 data point. Then what happens if you're the only son of an only son? There's no chance of 2 data points. So right away, you're hooped. You don't have a hope of having that second data point. So it was just an absolutely stupid approach, was the way I'd looked at it. And then the president of the Canadian Cancer Society made a blunder on stage, and someone challenged the use of PSA for people under the age of 50. And her comment was, you're only talking about 8,000 people per year. Well, fuck, I'm one of those 8,000. So I've rattled that chain a few times. And I think it's common sense now that by age 40, you should be getting your PSA tested. I don't know, what are you promoting, age 40? And in fact, I would argue with my son, given history, when I was attempting to explain to my family that prostate cancer was part of my life, it had been part of Dad's life, I tried to talk like it was just an ordinary part of life. And apparently the way I left my son was he knew he was getting it, and soon. So I tried to soften the message, but I screwed it up by not treating it seriously enough with him. But in the conversation with my son, his partner, his boyfriend, is a doctor, and that conversation is, the odds are high, Russ, you're going to get cancer. You're going to get prostate cancer. So best that by age 30 rather, we start getting a PSA, and it's all about the chart. It's not about the number, it's about the chart. So if you don't have the data, and I often say, data won't kill you. It can't kill you, it's just data. Ignorance might kill you. So when I hear a doctor, a medical professional, say that there is no validated way that you can stand behind PSA as a measure of determining that someone has prostate cancer, game on. I'll pay for the prostate cancer or the PSA test for that client, that patient. It makes no sense. And so I just hammer this point home because each of you are in yourselves a prophet for this conversation with others, encouraging family, encouraging friends, encouraging the next generation. Again, in the 30s is not too early, and by the 40s you should start getting that data point and build your own graph. You should know your numbers. I have my PSA done every 3 months now. It's a little overkill, but I've got a naturopathic doctor who wants it every 6 weeks, it feels like, and so we just double up, and there's an awful lot of good blood gets pulled for that purpose. But bottom line is I'm done, and I'm now going to take questions, and you've got the first one.
Having sons the same group would be one of their neighbors, but my son's getting 30. I say,
a little louder,
PSA.
Yeah.
But at some point, maybe perhaps by your mid-30s, you better be getting the digital.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that by mid-30s there's no reason not to test it.
I wondered about your thoughts as far as not just the PSA.
Well, the digital, all that stuff, but there's an awful lot of blood work. I mean, I can't tell you how many friends of mine don't bother getting annual physicals because if they don't know, what they don't know won't hurt them. Well, actually, it will hurt you. We're getting to the point in society where you can actually do some DNA testing. There's a lot of very refined testing where you could find out today what the highest probability is of what's going to kill you. A lot of people say, I'd rather just find out, wait for the bus to hit me. That can work, I get that, but having said that, a little bit of knowledge is in itself not going to kill you. I apologize for, I think there was 2 F-bombs. I promised there'd be less than 3. A little problem with that sometimes. I learned it from my daughter. She sailed around the world, and whatever. She got off the boat, and it was quite the experience. Anyway, so that was my journey. I'm a 2-time cancer graduate. I stepped up. Well, last story I'll tell was driving down with Doc Siemens. How many of you have heard of or know Doc? Just a legend, just one of the great people in this world. I remember as a young investment banker, even as an engineer, coming to Calgary, I knew of the Siemens brothers. So he's from small town Saskatchewan, I'm from small town Saskatchewan. He's an engineer, came to Alberta, I'm an engineer, came to Alberta. This guy was a role model on a pedestal for me in absolutely every way. His sense of community, his sense of what was right was pretty important. Anyway, I had the privilege of Doc knocking on my door, asking me to invest. His ask was $1 million in the prostate cancer program that he was trying to get off the ground, which you now call the Southern Alberta Institute of Urology. Doc and I were driving to a meeting down at the university, or at the hospital, and he had already made in his mind a commitment, and verbally I should say, he had told him he was there for $7.5 million. And he was asking me for $1 million. So I approached him and said, would you be interested in cutting your donation back to a level that I could match? And in this case, at that time, I had some good fortune, and I said, look, if you'll drop your donation from 7.5 to 5 million, I'll match you at 5 million. So now instead of them having 7.5, they've got 10, and they've got one of the old guard and one of the young guard in terms of co-lead donors. Well, you can imagine the look on their face when Doc said he was cutting his donation from 7.5 to 5. That didn't go over so well. Then he said, but I just brought in another 5. Now, he and I agreed to do something else with the extra money. And sorry, this is one of those. No, I'm on stage and I will call you back probably in 20 minutes. Yeah, love you. That's my son in Australia. And I have a view that voicemail is not for family. Anyone else would have gone to voicemail, but that will not ever happen with my family. And that only took 10 seconds. The opportunity, though, came up to put some money up for the Southern Alberta Institute of Urology. And I got to tell you, one of my prouder moments was being able to stand with Doc as we put funds in place. I think they raised $20 or $25 million. And what was happening at the time, the urologists and as well prostate had no place to hang. They all had their own clinics here and there. And so really when you think about the Southern Alberta Institute of Urology, it's a center of excellence. It's a gathering point where all of the best can be. Now, for those of you who've been in and out of there regularly, you might have seen me in and out of there regularly too, because the pipeline sometimes gets choked, the valves don't work, you've got to clean out the pipeline. I mean, there's a whole bunch of analogies I can use, but I'm a pretty regular consumer of the Southern Alberta Institute of Urology's services, so I'm glad we got that centralized.
Do you have to be contributed?
Pardon?
Do you still have to contribute?
Do I still have to contribute? No, I wrote the check. I'm done. I'm done. I think I pay through the hospital services. Go ahead, sir. Now, I don't know what we've got for time, but I'll take any amount of time. Yep, go ahead.
Thanks for sharing your story. So interesting. One question I have, it seems that the PET scan in the States was your savior. Since you've done that, has the PET scan become available here in Alberta?
No, and in fact, they're having trouble keeping it alive where it is because, and again, I'll drop some numbers on this. On an insured basis at the Mayo, again, on an insured basis, so don't compare this number to anything, but that's what they charge. It's a $20,000 test. So nobody does it. Now, I got it, I think it was $1,400, which in the context of finding the cancer seemed like reasonable money at this teaching hospital. Anyway, so the biggest problem is it's not a well understood diagnostic tool. I only mention it because there's some conversations. Actually, with a urologist in Calgary, when I said I'd just come back from doing radiation, he said, "Oh, you did radiation the first time." I said, "I did." And he said to me, a urologist in Calgary, less than a year ago, "Oh, I thought you could only do radiation once." Again, no ignorance. I'm not suggesting this guy's not a smart man, but again, without knowledge in terms of what's been happening in other places. So in this case, there is a common thought that you can't over-radiate one spot. I'm living proof. Don't touch my bladder with radiation. Do not go there. But in this case, in terms of the lymph nodes, the accuracy with which they were going was half a fingernail. And so it was unbelievably accurate. So that was the reason that I went down that protocol. But yeah, that tool was invaluable given that on day 1, I didn't know where I had cancer. Day 4, I knew exactly where it was. Go ahead.
Just so I was
just answers the gentleman's question here. The best they provide here is a body scan. That's the best. That's the closest thing you come to.
Yeah, there's different styles of scans. And again, I'm not going to suggest for a moment, because we went back and challenged the doctor who had done the reading, and he said, Brett, I hear you, but I don't see it. I don't see it. And again, he's trying to apologize without apologizing, because again, he's working with the tool that's available. I would like to see that tool in Canada. So I just assume that's a background project for me as well. Mr. Spence.
Were you right? Was it the lymph nodes where it came out?
Yep.
You're right about that.
Yeah, no, well, that's commonly held knowledge, though, that's where, again, if there's a doctor in the room, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding is that prostate, when it shows up again, if you will, or metastasizes, it's in the lymph nodes first, and then the bones.
I spoke to this group a few months ago. One thing I mentioned that strikes fear in me is if I get a pain in the rib, that scares Jesus out of me. And I know that maybe the fear is a little bit irrational, but as you pointed out, that's where it goes.
So the comment is that when Mr. Spence sees or feels a bit of pain in one of his ribs, the first thought in his mind is this cancer? I mean, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but yeah, but I genuinely believe or understand round 2, watching your PSA is the most important, because round 1, PSA is an indicator of a problem. It's not determinative. It doesn't define you. You've got to do other work. And that's why I often say if PSA is high, a good doctor will figure that out with you. Maybe it's BHP, maybe there's other issues. And then you do the biopsy. And for those who've been through the biopsy, isn't that fun? Anyway, I'd rather give birth. I mean, that's just, we're saying it. But you guys know, I mean, there's a quiet nod going, yeah, that was hear that staple gun go snap, bang! I'm sorry, I shouldn't be reliving that. But anyway, the idea is that on round 1, PSA is an indicator that you might have a problem. Round 2, there's a pretty high correlation that as it's coming back for a reason. So I'd watch the PSA and then tape your ribs. Go ahead.
Has anyone in the room or yourself done any research on HIFU?
HIFU? I have no experience. The question was, does anybody in the room have knowledge or experience with HIFU? You were treated that way? Where did you go for that?
I went to Toronto.
Toronto? Yeah. I think that's the only place that has it now. There was talk of one in Vancouver. I think the only one is in and you're to ask the blunt question. I mean, we're here sharing. How'd it go?
Great. It's 7 years ago.
7 years ago. Good for you.
Below 0.9 every time.
Good for you.
What's the alternative?
So I didn't mention HIFU, but HIFU is high intensity focused ultrasound. Yeah. And so yet another, and then I know there's proton beam, and cryotherapy, which is the freezing tool, seems to have gone the way of history. I don't know. I'm just not aware of anyone using that as a primary treatment modality anymore. I just don't. I'm sorry?
It's still out.
It's still available?
Yeah, it's only one guy that does it in Alberta, and that's gone.
Okay. Oh, Donnelly, yeah, he did. I knew he used to do it. I didn't know that he still did it. Yeah, I mean, I can find someone on either side of every argument for every treatment modality. So I'm really careful not to criticize any. I just know that that's the least commonly talked about now. And brachytherapy is, I think if you catch your cancer early, you've got lots of options. The further along you are, the more it might make sense to be in the world of radiation, because you're trying to attack what might be outside the gland. And then the conversation goes if it's in the lymph. So there's just other considerations. For those of you who are interested, there's a book. What's the name of that book? You know who I'm looking at, Miss Valad, or Miss Smith. What's the name of that book?
The funny one?
No. Scardino. That was the name I was looking for. Dr. Scardino updates on a regular basis what is the most readable and easily accessible book on, I think it's called Prostate Health or Urological Health, but it includes an awful lot of information. But Scardino's the god, and it's the easiest to read book. If you've got and it's balanced. I mean, I still remember the conversation between the radiation specialists and the surgeons. Pardon me, the radiation specialists and the surgeons when I was getting treated round one. Because basically the surgeon said, if the radiation doesn't get it all, you're dead. And of course the radiation specialist said, well, if you do surgery and they don't get it all, you're dead. So both of them were quite certain I was dead. The question was when, of course, but it looked like they were criticizing the other's modality or treatment tool. And that's where I love the Scardino book, because it has, as much as he by practice treats one area, it's very pragmatic and balanced in terms of the readability, and that's why I love Scardino's book. Any other conversation? We don't need questions. Go ahead.
First of all, I'm from Saskatchewan too, originally. I live in the States now. I played hockey in North Battleford, but that's not
The Barons?
the question. Yeah,
The Beaver Barons, as we know.
First of all, I really applaud you doing this. It takes courage to do what you're doing.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
I wonder, do you follow, given that you're a two-time survivor, do you follow next generation tumor sequencing, which, as you know, like in the States, on biopsies, we're actually decoding and figuring out what genes are out of whack to treat this stuff. There's all kinds of new approaches that, little shrink it and then radiation works and all that kind of stuff. Because it is an unlockable disease now, whether it's prostate or ovarian or breast cancer. So anyways, I just like to say thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. I wasn't sure I'd ever get invited back after the last time I talked. Well, one of the issues, I remember getting into this conversation, I asked the question, how many of you here suffer from erectile dysfunction? And we were in a theater, and every man's head tipped forward 10 degrees. There was no chance that we were going to have eye contact, because they knew that we were going to have this conversation. So I shared my experience. Oops, I wasn't going to do that twice, but now that we're here. Anyway, the way the conversation went last time, and maybe it was true, maybe not. But most of us have a hell of a challenge regaining erectile function. Doesn't matter what the treatment is, for a period of time. It might be 3 months, might be 6 months, might be a couple of years. And so I shared at that time that I'd gone through the learning stages of Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra. And at that time, Cialis had this 4-day weekender drug, as they called it. Don't ever take 2 of them at once. But I will also share. Anyone else want to go? Top that one. Obviously, no topic off limits. Go ahead.
I had HIFU treatment for prostate cancer, and unfortunately, the size of my prostate was much larger than what they had measured in Calgary.
Right.
I went to Toronto for it, and when they put me under and started looking at my prostate, they had never treated prostate that large.
Uh-oh.
And as a consequence, they had to shut down the process before it was completed because my core temperature got to dangerously low levels. They're flooding me with ice water while they're burning cancer.
Fascinating.
But the interesting
What year was that? How long ago was that you did that?
That was in 2005.
And the results today, you're still here, obviously.
I'm heading for my third trip.
Yeah, so you continue to go back, they can retreat?
No, that's the problem. The urologist that did the HIFU didn't say, look, we didn't complete our job. You better come back and get it finished.
Right.
The urologist in Calgary didn't say anything about it either. So 5 years later, it came back. This time I tried another alternative, and that was injections of vitamin C with mistletoe. And my PSA started dropping like a rock.
Good.
Wow. The problem was my family wouldn't buy into the injections. I
Because it was an odd treatment, they weren't buying into
One
it.
was a doctor, and he said, you can't do that, you gotta have radiation. So I wouldn't have had radiation. That didn't solve the problem completely, so then they put me on hormone therapy. And that took my meter PSA down to 0.5. 0.2.
Wow. How old are you now, sir?
I'm 89 years old.
89. Jesus. I'm going to sit down. You get up here and finish telling your story. I haven't even made it to 60 yet, and what a fuck. I mean, sorry, that was 3. What a.
I'm a great believer in investigating anything you can do
Right.
to help yourself. So I do a lot of research on the internet. And radiation for the hormone therapy brought it down to 0.2. And it stayed there for 2 or 3 months. It's now found climbed to 1.5. So it might be getting for a third lack. I'll have to decide what I do to tackle it. But you can't give up looking at it, following up on it. Some doctors don't want to hear that.
Well, I applaud, first of all, your creativity and your honesty and your integrity. And I've heard the comment made, again, I have no basis on this, that sometimes the hormone therapies are simply masking, not knocking it down. So there's a debate on that that's somewhat open-ended. But would I try it? Absolutely. And you're an inspiration to do
The
that.
side effects are awful. You get, ladies will know. You get hot flashes. You get hot flashes like you wouldn't believe. Even today, a year after my...
So you're a menopausal 89-year-old. Thanks for sharing, Vic. One more, and then I'll get off the stage. We're done. We can't open up any more than that. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh.